This is the lymphatic system, Chapter 20. The lymphatic system is very complex, and it is an important part of our body's system from protecting us against infection. It is a network of tissues and organs that help dispose of toxins, waste, and other unwanted material. The lymphatic system is part of the circulatory system and a vital part of the immune system. The lymphatic system includes lymph, which is a yellowish fluid containing white blood cells. It is made up of 95% water, and the other 5% consists of plasma proteins and other chemical substances. Lymphocytes, T cells, helper T cells, suppressor and cytotoxic T cells, B cells, and natural killer cells. The lymph vessels are tiny thin-walled structures that carry lymph. Lymphatic tissues, which include lymphatic nodules, Peyer's patches, tonsils, and gulf, which is gut-associated lymphatic tissue. And last, the lymphatic organs, the lymph nodes, thymus, and spleen. Here is the flow of lymph. It starts at the lymph capillaries, flows through the collecting vessels, to the trunks, through the ducts, and into the subclavian vein. The functions of the lymphatic system is to transport clean fluids back to the blood, drains excess fluids from tissues, removes toxins from the cell body, and transports fats from the digestive system. Lymph capillaries, which are also known as terminal lymphatics, include minivalves, lacteals, and chyle. Minivalves are where the endothelial cells overlap, which lets lymph in, but also prevents lymph from flowing back out into the tissues. Lacteals are a lymphatic vessel of the small intestine that absorbs digested fats. Chyle is a milky fluid that consists of lymph, emulsified fats or fatty acids. It is formed in the small intestine and transported by lacteals to the cisterna chyli. The lymphatic collecting vessels are low-pressure vessels that work like veins. The collecting vessels transports lymph to the trunks. They are lined by endothelial cells with a thin layer of smooth muscle. Their job is to transport lymph from the body back to the bloodstream. These vessels run along arteries and veins throughout the body, but are not found in the central nervous system, bone marrow, or teeth. The lymphatic trunks consist of 2 lumbar, 2 branchiomediastinal, 2 subclavian, 2 jugular, and 1 intestinal. There are 2 ducts, the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct, which I will show you more about the ducts in just a minute. First, I want to show you how it all starts. This picture will allow you to see how the lymph circulates. You can see the mini valve on the bottom right, which is compressed into the connective tissue. This is where the interstitial fluid comes in and turns into lymph. It then flows up into the lymphatic capillaries, which are wrapped around the blood capillaries on the top right of the picture. After the lymph leaves the capillaries, it is transported through larger lymphatic vessels to lymph nodes, which look like the green spider shapes on the top left of the picture. In the lymph nodes, the lymph is cleaned by lymphocytes before emptying into the right or left subclavian vein, where it is then mixed back into the blood. Lymph is transported and flows in a one-way direction towards the heart. Now back to the lymphatic ducts. Once the lymph gets to the ducts, it is then drained into either the right lymphatic duct or the thoracic duct. The right lymphatic duct receives lymph from the right arm, right side of the head, and thoracics, which empties into the right subclavian vein where it will return back to the blood. The thoracic duct is the largest of the two. It begins at the cisterna chyli and receives lymph from the left arm, left side of the head, neck, and thoracics, which empties into the left subclavian vein where it will return back to the blood. The lymph transport. Because the lymphatic system lacks a pumping organ, the valves, the pulsations of nearby arteries, contractions of skeletal muscles, movement of adjacent tissue, changes in thoracic pressure during breathing, and the pulsation of the walls of trunks and ducts are what help the lymph flow. A clinical aspect is lymphedema. It is the buildup of fluid in the body's tissues caused by the lymph system being blocked or damaged. It occurs when lymph is not able to flow through the body the way that it normally would. Here are the cells of the lymphatic system. The two main varieties of lymphocytes are the T and B cells. The other cells of the lymphatic system include the macrophages, which help activate T cells, the dendritic cells, which are spiny-looking cells that are similar to macrophages, and the reticular cells, which are fibroblast-like cells that produce a stroma that supports other cell types in lymphoid organs. Here are the classes of lymphocytes. The T cells have three types. The helper T cells are the major driving force of immune defense. Suppressor T cells are responsible for terminating the immune response when foreign bodies have been controlled or destroyed. Cytotoxic T cells, also known as the killer T cell, attacks and kills cancer, infected, or damaged cells by direct contact. The other class of lymphocyte is the B cell. B cells form plasma cells which produce and secrete antibodies. The last class is the natural killer cells, which are responsible for immune surveillance. Now we will take a look at the immune response and the difference between cellular and humoral immunity. Humoral immunity is antibody-mediated. Cell type are B lymphocytes, and the purpose and primary defense against extracellular pathogens, extracellular bacteria, and circulating virus. Cell immunity is cell-mediated. The cell type is T lymphocytes, and the purpose, primary defense against intracellular pathogens, viruses, and fungi, intracellular bacteria, and also plays a part in tumor antigens and graft rejection. When bacteria is engulfed by the macrophage, the cell presents antigens to activate the cytotoxic and helper T cells. In return, the cytotoxic T cell will directly destroy, and the helper T will activate B cells that will form plasma cells for antibodies versus antigens. Viruses infect tissue cells and cause antigens to appear on the cell surface of the macrophages that have been invaded or infected. Once the antigen is present, it activates the helper T cells, which will stimulate the B cells to release antibodies. In return, this will cause an activation of cytotoxic T and natural killer cells to destroy the infected cells. This slide will show you the production and maturation of lymphocytes. Red bone marrow is where all lymphocytes are produced. Then the T cell moves to the thymus to mature, where the B cell and natural killer cells stay in the bone marrow. Once matured, the lymphocytes will enter the peripheral tissues in search of abnormal cells. Peripheral tissue are the sites of lymphocyte activation by antigens. Now let's talk about the lymph tissues, which are found in the organs. The lymph tissue is an important component of the immune system because it houses and provides a growth site as well as furnishes a surveillance spot for lymphocytes. The tissue is composed of reticular connective tissue. The different types of tissue are diffuse lymphatic tissue, nodules, also known as lymphatic follicles. The nodules form part of the lymph nodes, appendix, and Breyer's patches. These nodules contain germinal centers that house B cells. The tonsils are located in the mucous membrane of the oral and pharyngeal cavities. There are two palatine tonsils, which are posterior lateral walls of the oral pharynx. There's one pharyngeal tonsil, which is posterior wall of the nasopharynx, and two lingual tonsils, which is the base of the tongue. The tiny tubule tonsils surround the opening of the auditory tubes into the pharynx. The tonsils gather and remove pathogens in food or inhaled air. The tonsils form crypts, which trap bacteria and forces the bacteria through the epithelium into the tissue where they are destroyed. The last part is MALT, which is mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, or GUL, which is gut-associated lymphatic tissue. They guard the body's entryways against pathogens. The largest collection are the tonsils, Pryor's patches, and appendix. Pryor's patches are in the small intestine. Appendix is found off the first part of the large intestine. The appendix prevents bacteria and generates memory lymphocytes. Now let's take a look at the three lymphoid organs. First, we have the lymphoid. The functions: they filter and cleanse lymph, and their immune system activation. The structures are the capsule of trabeculae, stroma, outer and inner cortex, medulla, medulla cords, lymph sinuses, also known as lymph capillaries. Each node is surrounded by a dense fibrous capsule that include trabeculae, which are connective tissue strands that divide the node into compartments. The stroma is the framework of the reticular fibers. The outer cortex contains germinal centers, and the inner cortex houses T cells and dendritic cells. In the medulla are the medullary cords that contain T and B lymphocytes. The lymph sinuses, also known as lymph capillaries, contain macrophages. The path of the flow of the lymph through the lymphoid starts at the afferent lymphatic vessels, then moves through the subcapsular sinus into smaller sinuses, which cuts through the cortex and enters the medulla. Once it passes through the medullary sinuses, it exits the hilum through the efferent lymphatic vessels. Clinical aspects of the lymphoid include buboes, which is composed by a swollen, inflamed lymphoid in the armpit or groin, and metastasis, which is a spread of a cancerous tumor inside the body. It starts at a primary site and moves it through the body to a secondary site. Next, we have the thymus. The thymus is located behind the sternum in front of the heart. The functions of the thymus: they house developing T lymphocytes and regulate lymphocyte activity. The structures include the lobes, lobules, thymocytes, which produce hormones to program lymphocytes. The cortex contains immature T cells that are being screened or trained, whereas the medulla contains mature T cells. The Hassel's corpuscles, also known as the thymic corpuscles, are bundles of fibers inside the medulla, the blood-thymus barrier. The blood-thymus barrier prevents the developing T lymphocytes of the cortex from being exposed to roaming antigens so that the T cells will not die before they mature. The largest of the organs is the spleen. The spleen sits under your rib cage on the upper left side of the abdomen. The spleen has many functions. It filters blood, removes old and damaged red blood cells, acts as a reservoir of blood, produces lymphocytes, preserves iron. The structures are the capsule with trabeculae, hilus, and white and red pulp. The hilus contains blood vessels, ducts, and nerve fibers. The white pulp is where the immune functions take place. The red pulp is where worn-out red blood cells and blood-borne pathogens are destroyed. Now, let's take a look at the circulation through the spleen. It starts in the splenic artery, through the trabeculae arteries, into the capsularies, through the red pulp to the sinusoids, and into the small veins, then exits the trabeculae veins into the splenic vein. The clinical aspects of the spleen is the splenectomy, which is a surgical procedure to remove the spleen or part of the spleen when it has been damaged. And this is our lymphatic system. Thanks for watching.